Beverly Hills, California. It was March 15th, 1960, 11:47 p.m. The living room at Nancy Sinatra Sr.'s house had fallen into complete silence, the kind of profound quiet that only occurs when something extraordinary has just happened. Frank Sinatra sat motionless in his leather chair, a half-finished Jack Daniels forgotten in his hand, staring at the young man who had just finished singing "He Knows Just What I Need," with such raw spiritual power that it seemed to transform the very air in the room. Elvis Presley stood beside the grand piano, his head slightly bowed, still lost in the emotional aftermath of the gospel song he had just delivered. The informal gathering, a small group of musicians, friends, and industry insiders, remained frozen in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to what they had just witnessed. Finally, Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who had never been impressed by anyone except perhaps Bing Crosby and Tony Bennett, slowly set down his glass and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus Christ, kid. I've been singing for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like that in my life." What happened next would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets in entertainment history, a moment of pure artistic revelation that showed Frank Sinatra, for perhaps the only time in his career, acknowledging that he had encountered something beyond his own considerable abilities. This is the documented story of the night Frank Sinatra heard Elvis Presley sing gospel music, the reaction that stunned everyone present, and how that single performance changed forever, how the King of Cool viewed the King of Rock and Roll. The relationship between Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley had been complicated from the moment Elvis burst onto the national scene in 1956. Sinatra, already established as America's premier entertainer, viewed the young rock and roll sensation with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal skepticism. Sinatra's initial public comments about Elvis and rock and roll were dismissive, even hostile. In a 1957 interview with Western World magazine, Sinatra had famously declared rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it has been my misfortune to hear. He saw Elvis as a threat to the sophisticated musical standards that he had spent decades establishing and defending. But Sinatra's private feelings about Elvis were more complex than his public statements suggested. According to those close to him, Sinatra was genuinely curious about Elvis's vocal abilities and stage presence, even as he publicly dismissed rock and roll as a cultural aberration. Frank was fascinated by Elvis, even though he wouldn't admit it publicly, recalled Jilly Rizzo, Sinatra's close friend and frequent companion. He'd watch Elvis's TV appearances when nobody was around, studying his technique, trying to understand what made him so popular with audiences. This private fascination led to the circumstances that would bring the two legends together on that March night in 1960, when Elvis was visiting Los Angeles following his discharge from the Army and his return to civilian entertainment. The gathering at Nancy Sinatra Sr.'s house was arranged through mutual connections in the entertainment industry, particularly through Colonel Tom Parker's relationships with various Hollywood power brokers. Parker understood that having Elvis accepted by established stars like Sinatra would be crucial to Elvis's transition from teenage rock and roll sensation to mature entertainer. Elvis, for his part, was nervous about meeting Sinatra. Despite his enormous success and growing confidence as a performer, Elvis still felt intimidated by the entertainment establishment that Sinatra represented. Frank was everything Elvis aspired to be: sophisticated, respected, taken seriously as both an artist and a cultural figure. Elvis was really anxious about meeting Sinatra, recalled Red West, who was with Elvis during this period. He kept asking what he should wear, what he should say, whether Sinatra would like him. Elvis might have been the most famous person in America, but he still felt like a kid from Mississippi when he thought about Frank Sinatra. The evening began awkwardly, with both men circling each other warily while their respective entourages watched for signs of tension or conflict. Sinatra was cordial but distant, treating Elvis with the kind of polite professionalism he showed to all new acquaintances until they proved themselves worthy of greater attention. Elvis, meanwhile, was uncharacteristically quiet, deferring to Sinatra's obvious authority in the room and waiting for some signal that he was welcome as more than just a curious novelty. The ice began to break when the conversation turned to music, specifically to the technical aspects of vocal performance and song interpretation. Sinatra was impressed by Elvis's knowledge of various singing techniques and his sophisticated understanding of how to communicate emotion through vocal inflection and phrasing. Elvis knew a lot more about music than Frank had expected, observed pianist Bill Miller, who was present that evening. They started talking about breath control, about how to build emotional tension in a ballad, about the difference between singing to an audience and singing for an audience. Frank realized pretty quickly that Elvis wasn't just some kid who got lucky, he was a real musician. The conversation gradually became more relaxed and personal, with both men sharing stories about their early careers, their influences, and their approaches to performance. Elvis spoke with genuine admiration about Sinatra's recordings, particularly his work on conceptual albums like In the Wee Small Hours and Songs for Swingin' Lovers. Sinatra, somewhat surprised by Elvis's musical sophistication, began to warm to the younger performer, recognizing in him a serious artist who happened to work in a different musical genre rather than simply a popular entertainer without real substance. The turning point came when someone suggested that Elvis sing something, not as a formal performance but as part of the evening's musical conversation. Elvis hesitated, unsure what would be appropriate for such a sophisticated audience, but Sinatra encouraged him, genuinely curious to hear Elvis sing in an intimate setting rather than for screaming crowds. Frank said something like, "Come on, kid, show us what you've got," recalled guitarist Al Viola, who was part of Sinatra's regular musical circle. But it wasn't a challenge or a test. It was more like one musician asking another to share their music. Elvis moved to the piano, his nervousness evident but his determination clear. Instead of choosing one of his rock and roll hits, which would have been the obvious choice, Elvis made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the evening. He began to sing "He Knows Just What I Need," a gospel song from his church background that few of the people in the room had ever heard. The choice was, inspired gospel music represented Elvis's deepest musical roots, the source of his emotional authenticity and vocal power. What happened next was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. Elvis's voice, freed from the constraints of commercial performance and audience expectations, soared with a spiritual power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere technical skill or artistic calculation. The gospel song allowed Elvis to demonstrate not just his vocal range and control, but his ability to channel genuine religious emotion into musical expression. His voice carried the weight of real faith, real spiritual struggle, real communion with something larger than himself. It was like watching a man pray, remembered actress Angie Dickinson, who was present that evening. Elvis wasn't performing that song. He was living it, breathing it, using it to connect with something sacred. I had never seen anything like it. Frank Sinatra's reaction was immediate and profound. The man who prided himself on emotional control and sophisticated reserve found himself completely overwhelmed by the authenticity and spiritual power of Elvis's performance. As Elvis sang, Sinatra's expression changed from polite interest to genuine amazement to something approaching awe. Here was a side of Elvis that the public rarely saw, not the hip-swiveling rock and roll rebel, but a deeply spiritual artist capable of expressing the most profound religious emotions through music. When Elvis finished the song, the silence that followed was electric with tension and wonder. Everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, but it was Sinatra's reaction that would make the moment legendary. "Jesus Christ, kid," Sinatra said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "I've been singing for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like that in my life." But Sinatra didn't stop there. He stood up, walked over to Elvis, and said words that would remain burned in the memory of everyone present. "You've got a gift from God, son. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." Coming from Frank Sinatra, the ultimate professional, the supreme vocal stylist, the man who had set the standard for American popular singing. These words carried unprecedented weight. Sinatra wasn't just complimenting Elvis, he was acknowledging him as a peer, as an artist whose abilities commanded genuine respect. The impact of Sinatra's reaction rippled through the room like an electrical current. If Frank Sinatra thought Elvis was extraordinary, then Elvis was extraordinary. The validation from America's most respected entertainer instantly elevated Elvis's status among the sophisticated Hollywood crowd that had previously viewed him with skepticism or condescension. But perhaps more importantly, Sinatra's reaction validated something that Elvis had always known about himself but had rarely been able to express publicly, that his deepest musical gift wasn't his ability to make teenagers scream, but his capacity to channel authentic spiritual emotion through his voice. Elvis knew he could really sing, but he hadn't had many opportunities to show that side of himself, observed Charlie Hodge, who would later become part of Elvis's inner circle. Most people only knew him from his rock and roll records, but Elvis's gospel singing was where his real power lived. Frank Sinatra heard that power and recognized it immediately. The conversation that followed Elvis's performance lasted until nearly dawn, with Sinatra and Elvis exploring their shared understanding of music as a form of emotional communication and spiritual expression. Despite their different backgrounds and musical styles, both men understood that great singing required complete emotional honesty and the courage to be vulnerable in front of audiences. Sinatra shared his own experiences with songs that had challenged him emotionally, particularly his work on torch songs and ballads that demanded complete personal investment. Elvis spoke about his gospel background and how sacred music had taught him that singing could be a form of prayer and communion. They were talking like two masters of their craft, observed arranger Nelson Riddle, who was present for part of the evening. All the differences in their ages, their backgrounds, their musical styles, none of that mattered when they were discussing the actual process of using your voice to reach people's hearts. The mutual respect that developed that evening would influence both men's subsequent careers and their relationship with each other. Sinatra never again made disparaging public comments about Elvis, and Elvis frequently spoke with admiration about Sinatra's professionalism and artistry. More significantly, the encounter encouraged Elvis to incorporate more of his gospel background into his later recordings and performances. Sinatra's recognition of Elvis's spiritual singing abilities gave Elvis the confidence to explore that aspect of his artistry more openly, leading to some of his most powerful and enduring recordings. The secrecy that surrounded this encounter reflected both men's understanding of its significance and their desire to protect something precious from commercial exploitation or media sensationalism. The people present that night were bound by an informal code of discretion that kept the story from becoming public for decades. Everyone understood that what happened that night was special, something that needed to be protected, recalled Jilly Rizzo. Frank didn't want it turned into a publicity stunt, and Elvis didn't want it cheapened by being turned into some kind of media story. This discretion allowed the encounter to retain its power and authenticity, existing as a purely artistic moment rather than a commercial or promotional event. The story was shared only among trusted friends and colleagues, becoming part of the private legend that surrounded both men. The impact of that evening on Frank Sinatra was profound and lasting. Friends and colleagues noted that his attitude toward Elvis changed completely, from dismissive skepticism to genuine respect and admiration. After that night, Frank never had a bad word to say about Elvis, remembered Sammy Davis Jr., who was told about the encounter by Sinatra himself. Frank would talk about Elvis's voice with the same respect he had for Nat Cole or Tony Bennett. That was huge coming from Frank. Sinatra's changed attitude toward Elvis was reflected in his willingness to work with him professionally. The famous Welcome Home Elvis television special in 1960, which featured both men performing together, was a direct result of the respect that developed from their private encounter. During the television special, Sinatra's genuine warmth toward Elvis was evident to viewers, though they didn't understand the source of this unexpected camaraderie. The chemistry between the two performers reflected their shared understanding of music as something more than mere entertainment. For Elvis, Sinatra's validation provided something he had been seeking throughout his career: recognition from the entertainment establishment that he was a serious artist rather than just a popular phenomenon. Frank's approval meant everything to Elvis, observed songwriter Doc Pomus, who worked with Elvis during this period. Elvis had always worried that sophisticated people thought he was just a flash in the pan, but Frank Sinatra's respect proved that he belonged in the company of real artists. This validation encouraged Elvis to take greater artistic risks in his subsequent work, particularly in his exploration of different musical genres and his willingness to tackle more emotionally demanding material. The influence of that evening can be heard in Elvis's later gospel recordings, which showed increased confidence and spiritual depth. Albums like His Hand in Mine and How Great Thou Art reflected Elvis's growing comfort with expressing his religious faith through music, partly inspired by Sinatra's recognition of his spiritual singing abilities. The story of Sinatra's reaction to Elvis's gospel singing also illuminates the complex relationship between commercial success and artistic respect in the entertainment industry. Both men struggled with the tension between popular appeal and critical recognition, and their encounter provided each with a different perspective on this challenge. Sinatra, who had built his career on sophisticated musical interpretation and artistic credibility, was reminded that authentic emotion could transcend genre boundaries, and that commercial success didn't necessarily compromise artistic integrity. Elvis, who had achieved unprecedented popular success but worried about being taken seriously as an artist, learned that his deepest musical gifts were recognized and respected by the most demanding critics and peers. The gospel song that catalyzed this mutual recognition represented something fundamental about American popular music: the spiritual roots that connected all authentic musical expression, regardless of style or commercial category. Both men understood that the greatest American singers, from Mahalia Jackson to Ray Charles to Aretha Franklin, drew their power from gospel music's tradition of emotional honesty and spiritual authenticity. The encounter between Sinatra and Elvis demonstrated that this tradition transcended racial, generational, and stylistic boundaries, creating common ground between artists who might otherwise seem completely different. As the years passed and both men's careers continued to evolve, the memory of that evening remained a touchstone for their understanding of what great singing could accomplish. Neither man spoke publicly about the encounter during their lifetimes, but both carried its influence in their subsequent work. Sinatra's later recordings showed greater willingness to explore emotional vulnerability, partly inspired by Elvis's example of complete spiritual openness in performance. Songs like It Was a Very Good Year and My Way reflected a deeper level of personal investment that may have been encouraged by witnessing Elvis's fearless emotional honesty. Elvis, meanwhile, continued to develop his gospel singing throughout his career, eventually winning Grammy Awards for his religious recordings and establishing himself as one of the great gospel performers of his era. The story of Frank Sinatra's stunned reaction to Elvis Presley's gospel singing has become one of the most cherished legends in American popular music, representing a moment when two giants of entertainment recognized each other's true artistic worth beyond commercial categories and public personas. The encounter demonstrated that great art transcends genre, generation, and commercial considerations, creating moments of recognition between artists who understand that their deepest responsibility is to authentic, emotional, and spiritual expression. In a world where entertainment is often reduced to commerce and competition, the story of Sinatra and Elvis finding common ground through gospel music reminds us that the greatest performers are united by their commitment to touching the human heart through the mystery and power of authentic artistic expression. The Room That Fell Silent, that March night in 1960, witnessed something more than a meeting between two famous entertainers. It witnessed a communion between two artists who recognized in each other the sacred calling that drives all great performers to transform personal truth into universal beauty through the incomparable power of the human voice.